Ladies and gents, welcome to Unit 2. So we just wrapped up Unit 1, where we explored geology, Earth's crust, and Earth's soils. In a sense, we sort of set the stage. And now it's time to populate that stage by looking at ecosystems. We study ecosystems through the science of ecology. And ecology can be defined as the science that focuses on how organisms interact with one another and with their non-living environment of matter and energy. Eco, of course, is the prefix for house, derived from a Greek word. So in a sense, we're studying our home. And it's a relatively new science, and it really blew up in the 1950s and 60s, and it was then, through a variety of studies, we started to develop an understanding of just how interconnected organisms are with each other, different species. And not only with each other, but with the physical environment. And consequently, we started to look at human activities in a different light. We started to understand that we can't really just simply tug at one thing in nature without finding the rest of the world attached to it. We break ecology down into basic levels of organization, going from small to large. I'd like you to look at these 5 terms and try to sequence them. Pause the video, going from smallest to largest. All right, how'd it go? The ecological focus, the hierarchy that sort of organizes the structure of ecology, going from small to large, is organisms, populations, communities, ecosystems, and the most inclusive, the biosphere. The biosphere is the most inclusive because it's basically the layer of Earth that includes life. It's pretty vague, so we're probably not going to focus too much on that. Starting with organisms as the smallest focus, however, we know an organism can be defined as any living being. And of course, organisms range in complexity. We can talk about single-celled, prokaryotic organisms, those that lack a nucleus and organelles, eukaryotic single-celled organisms, getting a little bit more complex now with a nucleus and organelles, and then complex multicellular organisms, increasing in complexity all the way to living organisms like you and I. A population is a group of organisms of the same species living in the same place. So for example, if we look at the woods on our campus, the Lam Woods, there is a population of chipmunks. There is a population of black oak trees, a population perhaps of white-tailed deer. Increasing in complexity, we look at communities. Communities are populations of different species living in a particular place and potentially interacting with each other. In other words, it's the chipmunks potentially interacting with the black oaks and the white-tailed deer in the Lam Woods. An ecosystem adds an added bonus feature to a community. An ecosystem is a community of different species interacting with one another and with their non-living environment. So it's all of those populations in the Lam Woods interacting with each other and interacting with the abiotic world, with soil, water, air, for example. This tends to be the major ecological focus these days. Most scientists agree that an ecosystem approach to managing our environment is the best because of those interactions between the abiotic and the biotic world. We can define an ecosystem as a massive area, like Yellowstone National Park. You could also make an argument that your tennis sneaker is its own ecosystem. It has sweat, perhaps bacteria, moisture. What sustains an ecosystem? What does an ecosystem actually need? The first thing that an ecosystem needs is a one-way flow of energy. The Earth is a system. It's a collection of parts that operate collectively. And with energy, it's assumed that the Earth is an open system. In other words, energy comes in, energy leaves. If we take a look at the sun, which is 150 million miles away, nuclear fusion happens, releasing an enormous amount of light and energy. This energy radiates across empty space, and a portion of it will reach the Earth. Now, as it moves through our atmosphere, it's going to interact, and just about 50% of that incoming light will actually reach Earth's surface. All of the energy that comes in that reaches Earth's surface eventually leaves. Energy in equals energy out. That is the first law of thermodynamics. We cannot create, nor can we destroy energy. Thankfully, however, we do have some gases in our lower troposphere that retain some of that heat to make the Earth livable. These are greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane. I know we talk about those in relation to climate change as a bad thing. However, without them, life would not be possible on planet Earth. It'd be a frozen ball of ice. So the gases trap in some of that outgoing infrared heat energy and keep the Earth nice and livable and warm. Nevertheless, all of the energy that comes in eventually leaves. So this is why we consider the Earth an open system for energy. When it comes to matter, though, the material of Earth, we call the Earth a closed system. Everything that we have on planet Earth is what we've always had and what we always will have. All the nitrogen, the carbon, the sulfur, the phosphorus, right? The rocks, the minerals, the water. We have a finite amount that simply cycles in our environment. You only have to think of the water cycle. So the same water that you drink for lunch is the same water that came out a dinosaur's mouth as drool millions of years ago. It simply just cycles. The only real inputs of matter that we have are the occasional meteorite impact. But generally speaking, everything is bound to Earth. And it's bound to Earth. We're encapsulated by an atmosphere that's held to Earth by gravity. So it's a one-way flow of energy, and it's a closed system for matter. I want to focus on the energy today, and specifically how energy sustains life on planet Earth. In other words, how do we access that energy from the sun? Well, you and I don't access it directly. The only ones that can do that are the producers. Producers are plants. We call them autotrophs, self-feeders. So we could be talking about terrestrial plants like a tree. We could be talking about aquatic plants like phytoplankton. And what these plants have in common is the ability to make their own food using sunlight. Right? We know this well. The process is photosynthesis. So the plants using and sequestering carbon dioxide with water with the help of sunlight convert that into food, into carbohydrates like glucose. And then they store that chemical energy in their biomass, in their tissue, so to speak. This is how life on Earth takes advantage of the sun. So we have the autotrophs making their own food. Well, everything else that's not an autotroph, therefore, has to get it by consuming autotrophs or other consumers. In other words, primary consumers access that energy from the sun by eating plants. They're called heterotrophs, other eaters. Primary consumers are vegetarians. They're eating the plant life. Secondary consumers then access that energy by consuming primary consumers. Secondary consumers eat meat. They consume the primary consumers. Finally, tertiary level consumers eat the secondary level consumers. So in this way, we get what we call trophic levels, feeding levels, energy levels. Where are they accessing their energy and food? And that's defined by the highest level that they feed upon. All of these things end up going to the decomposers and the detritivores, of course. These are the things, detritivores, like insects, macroinvertebrates, that mechanically break down the organic material, and then the bacteria and the fungi are the decomposers that chemically break it down through decomposition, converting it into inorganic nutrients. So we know this process quite well. Here's the equation for photosynthesis. Again, it's carbon dioxide reacting with water from the input of solar energy to convert it to carbohydrates or glucose, and it also releases oxygen. Well, how much of this glucose, how much of this stored chemical energy is available for the consumers? That's the question. What is the productivity? What is the rate at which this happens? And how much of this food is available for everyone else? Well, it turns out the plants have to use some of this energy. They're not just making it for the consumers, they're using it to survive. So in order to metabolize that, to burn it, and to use the energy that they just made, the stored chemical energy, they undergo cellular respiration. And notice how the equation is a reciprocal of photosynthesis. Where oxygen is required, it burns the glucose, and as a byproduct, it releases water and carbon dioxide. So how do we quantify the availability of energy that is produced from photosynthesis by the plants that will be available to consumers? We can calculate the NPP, or net primary productivity, with the following equation. GPP, or gross primary productivity, is the rate at which an ecosystem's producers convert solar energy into chemical energy as biomass, stored in their tissue as glucose. The thing is that the plants, while they produce a lot of glucose, that glucose is not available to consumers, not all of it, because ultimately the plants have to utilize it. They have to burn some of this stored chemical energy, and they do that through the process of respiration. What's left over is what is called the net primary productivity, and that is what is available to us. I like to relate this to sort of a bank account and a paycheck. If you can think of the GPP as your paycheck, imagine it's Friday, you get your big paycheck, you're super excited, you're thinking, well, great, I have a lot of money now. The thing is, you don't have all that money. You have to spend some of that money, right? You got to pay your rent. You got to buy groceries. You got to pay for some cable, internet, all of that stuff, right? You got college loans. So ultimately, your paycheck is not your bank account because you have spending. This is like your spending. This is what the plants are using. So what's left over? After your paycheck and you subtract your spending, that's what's going to be in your bank account. And this is what is going to be left over for consumers. So the NPP, which is the rate at which all of the plants can convert sun into stored chemical energy, minus the spending or the respiration that the plants have to utilize that material and energy, is what is available as NPP. So there are two problems at the bottom of this page, page 26, and you're going to utilize and apply this equation. It's fairly straightforward, simple algebra. So pause the video, and you're going to calculate NPP problems for both a wetland and a temperate grassland to determine NPP, GPP, and respiration. All right, guys, here's your two problems. Hopefully you didn't find it too difficult. You're just simply solving for one of the variables. With a wetland ecosystem, we found that the NPP is 1,000 kilocalories per meter square per year. Notice that's a derived unit that's describing the energy per area over time. We don't know the gross primary productivity, but we do know the respiration rate of the plants. So in order to calculate, we simply add 11,000 to 9,000, solving for GPP algebraically, giving us a GPP of 20,000 kilocalories per meter square per year. The next ecosystem was a temperate grassland. This was a bit more straightforward. We're just calculating NPP, which is GPP minus the respiration, 5,000 kilocalories meter squared per year, minus 2,500 kilocalories meter squared per year. That gives you a pretty easy math problem. NPP equals 2,500. We're going to be comparing these NPPs of different ecosystems in the future and to various food webs. So we're going to pause for now, and we'll see you next time in class.